One night can change everything. Elena Harper walked into a ballroom expecting celebration, her stepmother's birthday gala, a chance to heal old wounds. Instead, she got booze, whispers, and a spotlight of shame, accused of stealing her father's company right out from under her family. But here's the thing. Elena's got evidence, heart, and a promise to keep. What starts as a public humiliation ends as a daughter's stand for the truth. Let's dive into this story. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel shimmered like a jewel under the Texas night sky, its towering crystal chandeliers casting a warm, golden glow across the polished marble floors. The air buzzed with the clink of champagne flutes, the rustle of expensive gowns, and the low hum of laughter from Houston's business elite. It was the kind of scene Elena Harper had once only glimpsed from afar during her years as a touring pianist, elegant, exclusive, and utterly foreign to the quiet life she'd known behind a keyboard. Now, at 31, she stood in the midst of it, a reluctant guest at her stepmother Margaret Pierce's 55th birthday gala. She smoothed the fabric of her understated black dress, her fingers still calloused from years of ivory keys, and took a deep breath. She hadn't come for the glamour. She'd come for peace. It had been a year since her father, James Harper, passed away. A year of grief, of stepping into shoes she never thought she'd fill, of running Harper Manufacturing, the company he'd built from a single workshop into a cornerstone of Houston's industrial landscape. His death had left a rift between Elena and Margaret, one that had festered beneath polite smiles and curt phone calls. When the cream-colored invitation arrived last week, embossed with gold script and Margaret's looping signature, Elena dared to hope it was an olive branch. Maybe, she thought, they could finally move past the tension, the unspoken accusations, the cold silences that had defined their relationship since James's will was read. She'd spent the hour before, arriving rehearsing kind words in her mind, picturing a handshake, maybe even a hug. She couldn't have been more wrong. The evening began innocently enough. Elena arrived at the Westbrook Hotel just as the sun dipped below the horizon, its fading light painting the city in hues of orange and pink. She handed her keys to the valet, her modest sedan looking out of place among the sleek Bentleys and Teslas, and stepped into the ballroom. The space was breathtaking, walls draped in ivory silk, tables adorned with towering floral centerpieces, a string quartet weaving a delicate melody through the chatter. She spotted familiar faces: Gregory Thompson, CEO of their biggest client, Edward Winters, her father's retired CFO, countless others she'd worked with over the past year. They nodded at her, some with warm smiles, others with the polite detachment of professional acquaintances. She grabbed a champagne flute from a passing tray, more for something to hold than to drink, and scanned the room for Margaret. Her stepmother stood near the center of the ballroom, radiant in a deep emerald gown that hugged her frame, her silver-streaked hair swept into an elegant updo. At 55, Margaret carried herself with the poise of someone who'd spent decades perfecting her image, gracious, commanding, untouchable. Beside her was Sophia, Elena's 28-year-old stepsister, her blonde curls cascading over a crimson dress that screamed confidence. Sophia caught Elena's eye and offered a tight-lipped smile, one that didn't reach her hazel eyes. Elena raised her glass in a small toast, hoping to signal goodwill. Sophia turned away. The first hour passed in a blur of small talk. Elena mingled awkwardly, fielding questions about Harper Manufacturing's latest quarter, 22% growth, she'd say with quiet pride, and deflecting compliments about how well she'd stepped up since James's death. "Your father would be proud," a supplier remarked, clapping her on the shoulder. She smiled, though the words tugged at the guilt she carried daily. The years she'd spent on tour, chasing music while James aged alone, the missed birthdays, the phone calls she'd kept too brief. She'd always meant to come home more. She hadn't. Then, as the quartet paused and a hush settled over the room for Margaret's birthday toast, everything changed. Margaret ascended a small platform, microphone in hand, her smile wide and dazzling. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice smooth as velvet. "This night means the world to me, celebrating with friends, family, and the legacy my dear James left behind." Elena relaxed slightly, sipping her champagne. Maybe this really was a new beginning. But Margaret's smile faltered, her gaze locking onto Elena like a predator spotting prey. Of course, she continued, her tone sharpening. Not everyone here respects that legacy. The room stilled. Elena's stomach dropped. Elena Harper, Margaret said, her voice rising, I have something to say to you. She stepped off the platform, her heels clicking ominously against the marble as she closed the distance between them. Conversations died. Heads turned. Elena's fingers tightened around her glass. Give back what isn't yours! Margaret's shriek echoed through the ballroom, a sound so raw and furious it seemed to dim the chandeliers themselves. You stole my daughter's birthright! The accusation landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from Elena's lungs. She stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs as every eye in the room fixed on her. Margaret advanced, her face contorted with rage. That company, Harper Manufacturing, was meant for Sophia. James built it for his children, his real family, not some piano-playing dreamer who wormed her way in when he was too sick to see straight. Elena's mind reeled. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat, drowned by the rising tide of whispers around her. Stole it? Someone murmured. I heard she swooped in at the end, another voice added. She glanced at Sophia, who stood a few feet behind her mother, arms crossed, a faint smirk playing at her lips. The champagne glass trembled in Elena's hand, its contents sloshing dangerously close to the rim. She felt the weight of the room pressing in. The clients she'd fought to impress, the suppliers she'd negotiated with, the community leaders who'd once shaken her hand with respect. Now they stared with a mix of shock and curiosity, their faith in her crumbling before her eyes. Margaret, that's not... Elena started, her voice barely a whisper, but Margaret barreled over her. Don't you dare deny it. You manipulated him, twisted his mind when he was weak. You think we don't see through you? The venom in her words cut deep, slicing into the guilt Elena already carried. She'd never wanted this, never asked to trade her music for boardrooms and balance sheets. But James had chosen her, had seen something in her she hadn't seen in herself. And now, in front of Houston's elite, that choice was being torn apart. The quartet's silence stretched on, the absence of music amplifying the growing murmur of the crowd. Elena's legs felt like lead, her breath shallow. She wanted to run, to disappear into the night, but she couldn't move. Margaret stood inches away now, her eyes blazing with triumph. You don't belong here, she hissed, low enough that only Elena could hear. And soon, everyone will know it. The glass slipped slightly in Elena's grasp, a single drop of champagne splashing onto the floor. She was alone in a sea of faces, caught in an ambush she'd never seen coming. This wasn't a gala. It was a battlefield. And she was losing. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, once a sanctuary of elegance and warmth, had transformed into a crucible of judgment. The air thickened with the weight of Margaret Pierce's accusation, her words. You stole my daughter's birthright, still ringing in Elena Harper's ears like a discordant note she couldn't unhear. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to flicker, casting jagged shadows across the marble floor, as if the light itself recoiled from the scene unfolding below. Elena stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand, the cold stem biting into her palm. She felt the eyes of Houston's elite boring into her, clients, suppliers, community leaders she'd spent months earning trust from, now turning away, their faces hardening with suspicion. Margaret loomed before her, a vision of fury in her emerald gown, her silver-streaked hair glinting like a crown of thorns. She didn't relent. You think you can waltz in here, play the grieving daughter, and take what belongs to Sophia? Her voice rose, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the murmurs that rippled across the room. James built Harper Manufacturing for his family, his real family, not some outsider who only showed up when the end was near. Each syllable was a dagger, aimed not just at Elena's reputation, but at the tender scars of guilt she carried from years spent chasing music instead of staying close to home. Elena's gaze darted to Sophia, standing a few feet behind her mother. Her stepsister's crimson dress glowed like a warning signal, her arms crossed casually over her chest. A faint smirk curled her lips, her hazel eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, more like the quiet thrill of watching a plan unfold. Sophia had never cared about the company when James was alive. Elena could still picture her rolling her eyes at dinner tables, dismissing factory talk as boring. Yet now she nodded along to Margaret's tirade, a silent accomplice in this public execution. The crowd's reaction came swift and brutal. "She's right, you know," a voice muttered from a nearby table. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit, one of Harper Manufacturing's longtime suppliers. Elena recognized him. She'd negotiated a contract renewal with him just 3 months ago, laughing over coffee about their shared love of jazz. Now, his brow furrowed as he leaned toward his wife. It was strange how Elena appeared out of nowhere when James got sick. His wife nodded, her lips pursing in disapproval. Another voice chimed in, this one from a cluster of community leaders near the bar. "I always wondered about that, Will. Seemed too convenient." The whispers spread like wildfire, igniting a chorus of doubt that drowned out the string quartet's earlier melody. Elena's chest tightened, her breath shallow and ragged. "That's not what happened," she said, her voice trembling, barely audible over the growing din. She took a step forward, desperate to reclaim some shred of control. "Dad's will was clear. He wanted me to have the company because I cared about it, because I understood it." But her words sounded small, fragile, like a child's plea lost in a storm. Margaret pounced. "Cared about it? You?" She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed off the silk-draped walls. "You were off tinkling keys in Europe while James was here, building something real. You're no daughter of his, not like Sophia. You're a charity case who saw an opportunity." The insult hit like a physical blow, and Elena's eyes stung with unshed tears. She'd toured for years, yes, Vienna, Paris, New York, chasing the music that had been her lifeline after her mother's death. She'd lived in cramped apartments, survived on instant noodles, and poured her soul into every note, all while James cheered her on from afar. "You've got your mother's gift," he'd tell her over crackling phone lines, pride in his voice. But Margaret was right about one thing. Elena hadn't been home enough. The guilt of those missed years gnawed at her daily, a quiet ache she'd never shaken. To hear it weaponized now, flung at her in front of 100 witnesses, was unbearable. The room seemed to close in, the murmurs swelling into a wave of open hostility. "Boo!" someone shouted from the back, a single sharp sound that pierced the air like a gunshot. Elena flinched, her champagne glass slipping further in her grasp, a bead of liquid spilling onto her wrist. More voices joined the fray. "She doesn't belong here," a woman in a pearl necklace hissed, loud enough for Elena to hear. "How could James let this happen?" a gray-haired man added, shaking his head. She scanned the sea of faces, searching for an ally, Gregory Thompson maybe, or Edward Winters. But even they looked away, their expressions clouded with uncertainty. Margaret stepped closer, her voice dropping to a calm, cutting edge, the confidence of someone who knew she'd won. "I think you should leave, Elena," she said, loud enough for the room to hear, but with a chilling composure. "Nobody wants a thief at my celebration." The word thief hung in the air, heavy and final, sealing Elena's fate. She felt the weight of it press against her chest, stealing the last of her breath. Her legs trembled beneath her, the black dress suddenly too tight, too warm. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell them about the late nights she'd spent learning the business, the sacrifices she'd made to honor her father's trust. But the words wouldn't come. She was drowning in their stares, their judgment, their rejection. With a final shaky glance at Margaret's triumphant sneer and Sophia's smug nod, Elena turned toward the exit. The crowd parted slightly, a reluctant corridor forming, as she stumbled forward, her heels clicking unevenly against the marble. The doorman's eyes widened as she passed, his earlier smile replaced by a flicker of pity. She pushed through the heavy glass doors, the cool night air hitting her like a slap, and made it halfway across the parking lot before her knees buckled. She caught herself against a lamppost, the champagne glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the asphalt with a soft, crystalline crash. She stood there, alone under the flickering light, the echoes of the ballroom's hostility ringing in her mind. Margaret had turned her father's legacy into a weapon, and Sophia had stood by, complicit. The people Elena had worked so hard to prove herself to, clients she'd won over, leaders she'd impressed, had turned on her in an instant. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her racing heart. One thought cut through the haze of shame. She couldn't let this stand. Not tonight. Not ever. But as the tears welled up, blurring the neon glow of the Westbrook Hotel sign. She didn't yet know how to fight back, only that she had to. The parking lot of the Westbrook Hotel stretched out before Elena Harper like a shadowed wasteland, the neon glow of the hotel's sign casting a sickly yellow sheen across the asphalt. Her black heels clicked unevenly as she stumbled away from the grand ballroom, the shattered remnants of her champagne glass glinting behind her under a flickering lamppost. The cool March air bit at her bare arms, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the gala, but she barely felt it. Her chest heaved with ragged sobs, each one tearing loose from a place so deep she hadn't known it existed until tonight. She reached her car, a modest gray sedan dwarfed by the luxury vehicles around it, and fumbled with the door handle, her trembling fingers slick with sweat and spilled champagne. The lock clicked open, and she collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut as if it could seal out the humiliation still ringing in her ears. Elena gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening as tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless. The grand ballroom's hostility replayed in her mind like a broken record. Margaret Pierce's venomous shriek, "You stole my daughter's birthright?" Sophia's smug smirk, the boos and whispers from people she'd fought to impress. These weren't strangers. They were Houston's business community, the clients and leaders she'd spent a year earning respect from since her father, James Harper, passed away. She'd sat across from them in boardrooms, shared coffee with them at dawn meetings, celebrated small victories with late-night emails, and in one night, Margaret had turned that trust to ash. She pressed her forehead against the wheel, the cold leather grounding her as her sobs slowed to shuddering breaths. How had it come to this? A year ago, she'd been on stage in Vienna, her fingers dancing across piano keys, the music a lifeline to the mother she'd lost at 12. James had been her biggest fan, wiring her money for train tickets when gigs ran dry, his voice warm over staticky calls. "You're your mother's daughter, Elena. Keep playing." She'd always meant to come home more, to sit with him in the sprawling Houston house he'd filled with her childhood memories after her mom died. But the tours stretched on, the years blurred, and then the call came. Cancer, advanced, months left. She'd flown back that night, her suitcase still packed with sheet music. James had married Margaret when Elena was 15, bringing her and 12-year-old Sophia into their lives. Margaret had been charming then, a widow with a sharp smile and a knack for hosting dinners that kept James's business associates dazzled. Sophia was quieter, a girl with blonde curls and a habit of disappearing into books or her phone when factory talk came up. Elena had tried to bond with her, shared piano lessons, late-night ice cream runs, but Sophia's cool detachment never thawed. James adored them both, though, calling them "my girls," with a grin that lit up his weathered face. Elena hadn't seen the cracks forming beneath Margaret's polish until it was too late. 3 years ago, the diagnosis hit. Elena was in Chicago, mid-tour, when James called. "It's not good, kiddo," he'd said, his voice steady despite the news. She'd canceled everything, gigs, flights, dreams, and rushed to his bedside. He was thinner than she'd ever seen him, his once robust frame swallowed by hospital sheets, but his eyes still sparkled with the cunning that had built Harper Manufacturing from a garage workbench into a 40-year legacy. One night, as machines beeped softly around them, he took her hand. "Elena," he rasped, his grip weak but firm. "You've got a mind for this. Numbers, strategy, people. Sophia's smart, but she doesn't care about the company. She'd rather be anywhere else. You do. I've seen it. How you ask questions, how you dig in." He paused, wincing as he shifted. "I'm leaving it to you. Promise me you'll take care of it." She'd nodded, tears blurring his face, and whispered, "I promise." The next day she called her agent and quit touring. When the will was read a year ago, naming her CEO of Harper Manufacturing, Margaret and Sophia had sat in stony silence across the attorney's desk. Elena thought they had accepted it. James had left them trusts, generous ones, but the subtle jabs started soon after. Missed meetings, snide comments, rumors whispered behind her back. Tonight's gala was the breaking point, a year-long campaign erupting into a public reckoning. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her knuckles. The humiliation burned like acid, eating through the fragile confidence she'd built. She'd traded her music for this, late nights poring over spreadsheets, Weekends learning supply chains, mornings shaking hands with men twice her age who'd smirked at the pianist playing CEO. She'd grown the company 22%, saved jobs, earned nods of respect. And yet, in that ballroom, none of it mattered. Margaret had painted her as a thief, and the crowd had believed it. Her phone buzzed in her purse, jolting her from the spiral. She fished it out, the screen glowing with a text from Charles Dalton, James's longtime attorney and the executor of his will. Just heard what happened. Are you okay? Call me. Charles, gray-haired, gruff, a man who'd known her since she was a kid banging on James's desk with toy hammers. She hesitated, then dialed, her voice shaky as it spilled out. Margaret? She accused me of stealing the company, right there in front of everyone. They booed me, Charles. They think I manipulated Dad. This is unacceptable, Charles growled, his familiar baritone cutting through her haze. Margaret knows damn well James was sound when he wrote that will. She's pulling a stunt. Elena sniffed, clutching the phone tighter. They all believed her. Everyone in that room thinks I'm a liar. There was a pause, the faint rustle of papers on his end, and then he asked, Do you have your laptop with you? She blinked, confused. It's in the trunk. Why? Good, he said, a hint of steel in his tone. Meet me at my office in 30 minutes. If Margaret wants to play this game in public, we'll give them the whole damn story. Every document, every truth James left to protect you. Elena sat up straighter, her tears slowing. Charles, I don't know if I can go back there. You can, he said firmly. And you will. I'll be waiting. She ended the call, staring at the phone as her pulse steadied. The shame still throbbed, raw and relentless. But beneath it, something flickered, a spark of defiance, faint but growing. She thought of James's hand in hers, his trust, his words. Take care of it. She'd promised him. And she wouldn't let Margaret, or anyone, take that away. Not tonight, not ever. She turned the key in the ignition, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled out of the lot, the Westbrook Hotel shrinking in her rearview mirror. The streets of downtown Houston blurred past Elena Harper's windshield, a mosaic of neon signs and Saturday night traffic lights reflecting off the glass. Her sedan hummed steadily, the engine's low rumble a counterpoint to the chaos still churning in her chest. The tears had dried on her cheeks, leaving tight, salty streaks, but her hands gripped the steering wheel with a determination she hadn't felt an hour ago. The Westbrook Hotel's parking lot, and the sting of Margaret Pierce's ambush, faded in her rearview mirror as she sped toward Charles Dalton's office. His voice echoed in her mind. We'll give them the whole damn story. For the first time since fleeing the gala, a fragile hope flickered beneath her shame, a chance to fight back, to reclaim what her father, James Harper, had entrusted to her. Charles's building loomed ahead, a sleek tower of glass and steel cutting into the night sky. A single light glowed from the 10th floor, a beacon in the dark. Elena pulled into the underground garage, her tires squeaking against the polished concrete, and grabbed her laptop from the trunk. The weight of it felt grounding, a lifeline to something solid amid the wreckage of the evening. She rode the elevator alone, the hum of its ascent mingling with her uneven breaths. When the doors slid open, Charles was waiting, his broad frame filling the hallway. His gray suit was rumpled, tie loosened, but his eyes, sharp and steady, met hers with a quiet intensity. You made it, he said, stepping aside to let her in. Good. The office smelled of old leather and coffee, a familiar scent that tugged at memories of childhood visits. Tagging along with James, doodling on legal pads while he and Charles debated contracts. Now, the room was a war room. Stacks of binders lined the desk, neatly labeled in Charles's precise handwriting, court filings, financials, testimony. File boxes spilled onto the floor, their contents a testament to James's foresight. Charles gestured to the chaos. I've been organizing this since your father passed. He knew Margaret might try something like this. Always thinking 3 moves ahead, that man. Elena set her laptop on a chair, her voice still raw. Why now? She's contested the will before and lost every time. What does she gain by humiliating me in public? Charles pulled a binder from the pile, his gray eyes darkening. Control, Elena. Margaret's always been about appearances, social standing, power. She can't take the company legally, so she's trying to make your position untenable. Turn the business community against you, force you to crack. He tapped the binder, but James saw it coming, and he left you everything you need to fight back. He handed her a USB drive, small and unassuming, its surface cool against her palm. This is the heart of it, he said. Video testimony recorded 3 months before he died. James explaining why he chose you, clear as day, sharp as ever, with a doctor and me as witnesses. Elena clutched it, a lump rising in her throat. She remembered that day. James in his study, frail but defiant, insisting on the recording despite her protests that he should rest. I haven't watched it since, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Couldn't bear it. Charles nodded, his expression softening. You don't have to now, but they will. He moved to a stack of files, pulling out papers with swift precision. There's more. Financials showing how you've grown Harper Manufacturing by 22% since taking over. Employee letters praising you for saving jobs when the Anderson contract tanked. Board minutes where you offered Sophia a director role. She turned it down, said it was too much paperwork. He smirked faintly. James documented everything. Sophia's disinterest, the management courses he had you take while touring, the strategy sessions you two held whenever you were home. Elena paced the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood, as anger slowly eclipsed her earlier despair. He knew, she said, half to herself. He knew they'd twist it. Charles nodded, sorting documents into piles. He did, and he trusted you to handle it. Look here. He handed her a transcript of a recorded dinner, Sophia's voice captured mid-eye roll. I'm not spending my life making industrial junk. Another page showed a declined training offer, her signature scrawled at the bottom. Elena's jaw tightened. She never cared. Not once. Exactly, Charles said, plugging the USB into his computer. The screen flickered to life, James's gaunt face filling it. His voice rasped through the speakers. My daughter Elena has the passion and the skill for this. And Elena turned away, blinking back tears. Charles paused it. That's your ace, but we've got a full deck. He pointed to the binders. Court rulings. 3 times Margaret challenged the will, 3 times she lost. Medical reports proving James was competent. Every piece of evidence says you're the rightful CEO. A plan sparked in Elena's mind, sharp and electric. We take this back to the gala, she said, her voice steadier now. Show them everything, tonight. Charles grinned, understanding dawning. My color printer's still lightning fast, and I've got plenty of binders. He grabbed his phone, dialing quickly. I'm calling in some backup. 3 colleagues, good attorneys, willing to meet us there. They'll add weight to this. For the next hour, they worked in tandem, a quiet frenzy of purpose. Charles printed court decisions, financial charts, employee testimonials, while Elena organized them into sleek presentation binders, 1 for each table at the gala. She labeled them with crisp stickers, her hands moving with the precision she'd once reserved for piano keys. Charles barked orders into his phone. Meet us at the Westbrook in 20, bring your A game. And 3 voices agreed without hesitation. The room hummed with energy, the stacks dwindling as their arsenal grew. As they finished, Charles stacked the binders into a box, his voice low but firm. This isn't just about clearing your name tonight, Elena. It's about securing your place for good. After this, Margaret won't have a leg to stand on. Elena checked her watch, just past 10 p.m. The gala would still be in full swing, Margaret basking in her victory. She hefted a box, her shoulders squaring. Dad always said in business, you don't just defend yourself. You hit back so hard they regret starting the fight. Charles smiled, a rare warmth breaking through his gruff exterior. He'd be proud of you tonight. Let's go. They loaded the boxes into his SUV, the weight of the evidence a tangible promise. Elena slid into the passenger seat, her laptop on her lap, the USB drive tucked into her pocket. As Charles pulled out of the garage, the city lights streaked past, and for the first time since Margaret's outburst, Elena felt something beyond shame, a fire, small but fierce, ready to burn through the lies. The Westbrook Hotel loomed against the Houston skyline like a fortress of light, its grand facade glowing as Eleanor Harper sat in the passenger seat of Charles Dalton's SUV. The binders of evidence, meticulously assembled in his downtown office, sat stacked in the back, each one a brick in the wall she was about to rebuild around her father's legacy. The drive from Charles's building had been silent, the hum of the engine and the faint pulse of Saturday night traffic filling the space where words failed. Elena's fingers traced the edge of the USB drive in her pocket, her heart hammering with a mix of dread and resolve. She'd fled this place in tears 2 hours ago, branded a thief by Margaret Pierce. Now, she was returning, not as a victim, but as a fighter. Charles navigated through the valet line, the SUV's tires crunching against the gravel as they pulled up to the entrance. 3 figures waited near the curb, Charles's attorney colleagues, impeccably dressed in dark suits, their faces set with quiet determination. "Tom, Richard, Laura," Charles greeted, stepping out to shake their hands. "Thanks for coming on short notice." Tom, a wiry man with silver hair, nodded. "Wouldn't miss it. James was a good man. Time to set this right." They unloaded the binders, distributing the weight among them, a legal squadron ready for battle. Charles turned to Elena, his gray eyes steady. "Remember, you're not just James Harper's daughter tonight. You're the CEO of Harper Manufacturing. Own it." Elena took a deep breath, smoothing her black dress, still creased from her earlier collapse in the parking lot, and stepped out. The same doorman who'd watched her flee now hesitated, his eyes widening as she approached, flanked by 4 attorneys in a phalanx of purpose. He stepped aside wordlessly, holding the heavy glass doors open. The muffled sounds of the gala spilled out, clinking glasses, laughter, the lilting strains of the string quartet. Elena's legs trembled slightly, but she squared her shoulders, the weight of the binders in her arms a grounding force. This was her moment. The grand ballroom doors swung open, and she crossed the threshold, Charles at her side, the others fanning out behind. The room buzzed with life, oblivious to their arrival at first. Guests swirling in elegant clusters, Margaret holding court near a towering cake display, Sophia at her elbow with a champagne flute in hand. The quartet played a familiar waltz, its notes weaving through the perfumed air. Then, a hush rippled from the nearest tables, heads turning as Elena's heels clicked against the marble. The silence spread like a tide, conversations dying, glasses pausing mid-sip. Margaret's triumphant smile faltered as she spotted them, her emerald gown catching the light as she froze. Charles stepped forward, his baritone cutting through the stillness. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse the interruption. I'm Charles Dalton, longtime counsel to James Harper and executor of his estate. There's been a misunderstanding about Harper Manufacturing that needs clearing up." The quartet stopped mid-note, bows hovering above strings, and every eye fixed on them. Elena felt the weight of those stares, familiar faces now etched with confusion rather than scorn. Charles continued unflinching. "Earlier tonight, serious accusations were leveled against Elena Harper, the rightful CEO. My colleagues and I are here to present the legal and factual record." The attorneys moved with precision, distributing binders to each table, crisp white covers gleaming under the chandeliers. Guests hesitated, then reached for them, curiosity overtaking their initial shock. Elena walked to the small stage where the quartet sat, her hands steady as she accepted a microphone from a wide-eyed violinist. She turned to face the room, her voice stronger than she'd expected. 2 hours ago, I was accused of stealing my father's company. I was called a thief, a manipulator, booed and humiliated in front of all of you. She paused, scanning the crowd. Some looked down, guilt flickering in their eyes. Others leaned forward, brows furrowed as they opened the binders. "My stepmother, Margaret Pierce, orchestrated that scene," Elena said, her gaze locking onto Margaret, who clutched her flute tighter. "What she didn't tell you is that she's contested my father's will 3 times in court, and lost every time." Charles connected his tablet to a projector, and the massive screen behind Elena flared to life with court documents, stamped with judicial seals. Margaret started toward her, fury twisting her features, but Tom and Richard stepped smoothly into her path, their presence a quiet wall. Elena nodded to Charles. "Before I say more, I'd like you to hear from my father." The USB drive clicked into place, and the screen flickered. James Harper appeared, gaunt, his once robust frame diminished by illness, but sitting straight in his leather chair, eyes sharp with purpose. The room fell into a reverent silence. "My name is James Harper," his raspy voice began, steady despite the strain. "I'm recording this on March 15th of last year, with my attorney Charles Dalton and Dr. Catherine Wilson, who certified my mental competence. The camera panned to show Charles and a woman in a white coat, then returned to James. Several guests gasped, hands rising to mouths. Some hadn't seen him in his final months, hadn't known how the cancer had ravaged him. I've decided to leave controlling interest in Harper Manufacturing to my daughter, Elena, James said, wincing slightly as he adjusted his position. I anticipate this might cause conflict after I'm gone, so let me be clear. Elena has the acumen and passion to lead this company. Despite her career as a pianist, she's spent countless hours learning the business, taking courses I recommended, analyzing operations, strategizing with me whenever she was home. The video cut to clips. Elena at the factory, poring over blueprints with James, meeting clients, her face lit with focus. My stepdaughter, Sophia, has had every opportunity to engage but has declined. She's said, and I quote, "I have no interest in making boring industrial parts." The screen shifted to Sophia at a family dinner, rolling her eyes as she spoke those exact words, then to a meeting where she waved off a training offer with a bored sigh. James's voice returned. "I love both my daughters, but a business needs someone who loves it. Elena does. I'm of sound mind making this decision." Dr. Wilson appeared, confirming his competence, her credentials flashing below. The video ended with James looking into the camera, a faint smile on his lips. "I trust Elena to protect my legacy and the livelihoods of everyone at Harper Manufacturing." As the screen went dark, a murmur swept the room. Shock, realization, discomfort. Elena gripped the microphone, her voice rising. "That's the truth Margaret didn't want you to hear. My father chose me, not because I manipulated him, but because he believed in me." She glanced at Margaret, whose face had paled, then back to the crowd. "And I've honored that trust. Look at the binders. See for yourselves." Guests flipped pages, financials, employee letters, court rulings, whispers growing as the evidence sank in. Margaret's champagne flute trembled in her hand, Sophia whispering urgently at her side. Elena stood tall, the fire in her chest blazing now. She'd walked back into this battlefield, and this time, she wasn't running. The grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel hung in a fragile stillness, the echo of James Harper's recorded voice fading into the air like a lingering chord. The massive screen behind Elena Harper went dark, but his words, "I trust Elena to protect my legacy," resonated in the silence, a quiet thunder that shifted the room's energy. The crystal chandeliers cast their golden light over the binders, now open on every table, pages rustling as Houston's elite pored over the evidence Charles Dalton and his team had distributed. Elena stood on the small stage, microphone in hand, her black dress creased, but her posture unyielding. The weight of Margaret Pierce's earlier accusations, thief, manipulator, still lingered, but the tide was turning. She could feel it in the shifting glances, the murmurs of disbelief replacing hostility. She took a steadying breath, her voice clear and firm as she addressed the crowd. "Since taking over Harper Manufacturing, I've worked every day to honor my father's trust. Under my leadership, we've increased revenue by 22%, expanded into 2 new markets, and added 17 jobs." Charles tapped his tablet and financial charts flared onto the screen. Sharp upward lines, a story of growth told in numbers. When the Anderson contract fell through last year, I fought to avoid layoffs. Page 12 of your binders has letters from our employees, people who worked for my father for decades, supporting what we've built together. Guests flipped to the page, eyes scanning handwritten notes. "Elena saved my job when I thought I'd lose everything," one read. "She's got James's heart and his head," said another. Elena's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on faces she knew: Gregory Thompson, Edward Winters, suppliers she'd negotiated with late into the night. Some met her eyes now, guilt flickering in their expressions. Others kept their heads down, absorbed in the documents. "Page 15, she continued, her voice gaining strength, shows a formal job offer I extended to Sophia 3 months ago. A director position with real authority, minimal day-to-day grind. She declined via email, saying she had better things to do than waste time in a factory." Charles projected the email, Sophia's curt words glowing on screen. A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd, heads turning toward Sophia, who stood beside Margaret, her crimson dress suddenly too bright against her reddening face. The final section, Elena said, stepping closer to the edge of the stage, contains court decisions rejecting Margaret's challenges to my father's will. 3 different judges, 3 findings of no manipulation, no undue influence. Medical reports confirm Dad was fully competent when he chose me. She set the microphone down for a moment, her hands steady as she looked directly at Margaret, who stood frozen near the cake display, champagne flute clutched like a lifeline. "You asked me to return what isn't mine," Elena said, loud enough for all to hear. "But as these documents prove beyond doubt, Harper Manufacturing is exactly where my father wanted it, in my hands." She picked up the microphone again, turning to the room. "I understand many of you were misled tonight. You heard one side of a complicated story and reacted based on what you knew. I don't blame you for that." She paused, letting her words settle. "What I ask is that you review the evidence before you and decide for yourselves what's true." The atmosphere shifted, hostility melting into discomfort, then something softer. Gregory Thompson, CEO of their largest client, stood from his table, his deep voice carrying across the room. Elena, I owe you an apology. I should have questioned those accusations. I was wrong." His public admission broke a dam. Murmurs of agreement followed, and a slow clap started at a back table, spreading unevenly through the crowd. Margaret's composure cracked. She shoved past Tom and Richard, storming toward Elena, Sophia trailing behind her. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous, her emerald gown swishing with each furious step. "This is my birthday celebration, and you've turned it into a corporate circus. This is why James should have never trusted you. No class, no decency." Elena met her gaze, calm now, the fire in her chest steady. "Interesting perspective, Margaret, considering you used your own party to accuse me of theft and have me thrown out." Sophia jumped in, her voice shaking with anger. "You manipulated him when he was dying. You were barely even around." Charles stepped forward, tablet in hand, his tone clipped. "Actually, hospital and hospice logs show Elena visited James 83 times in his final 6 months. Sophia, you visited 12. Mrs. Pierce, 37. Sophia's mouth opened, then closed, her argument crumbling. Margaret's face contorted, desperation breaking through. "The company was supposed to secure our future. James promised we'd be taken care of." "And you are," Elena said firmly. "Dads will set up trusts for you both, generous ones. You'll never want for money." She lowered her voice, stepping closer so only they could hear. "What he didn't do was give you control of his life's work, because he knew you'd let it fall apart." Margaret's eyes blazed, and for a moment, Elena braced for a slap. Instead, she grabbed Sophia's arm, yanking her toward the exit. "This isn't over!" She threw over her shoulder, her voice shrill. Charles called after her, cool and final. "Actually, it is. Any further challenges will be deemed vexatious litigation. We'll seek sanctions." The doors swung shut behind them, and the tension in the ballroom deflated like a held breath released. Guests approached Elena, offering apologies and congratulations in equal measure. "I always thought Margaret's story sounded off," a supplier muttered, shaking her hand. "You've done wonders with the company," another added. Edward Winters, James's old CFO, shuffled over, his weathered hand squeezing hers. James was right about you. You've got his backbone. He used to say you had your mother's talent, but his head for business." Tears pricked Elena's eyes, not of shame this time, but pride. "Thank you, Edward. That means everything." As the evening resumed, the quartet striking up a tentative tune, Elena found herself surrounded by support instead of scorn. Charles stood nearby, a satisfied smile tugging at his lips, as his colleagues collected the binders. Their purpose served. "What now?" he asked, leaning in. Elena glanced around, at the clients she'd need, the leaders she'd won back, the future of Harper Manufacturing stretching before her. "Now," she said, straightening her shoulders, "I network. I'm not just James Harper's daughter tonight. I'm the CEO." The weight of that truth settled over her, warm and solid. She'd walked back into this room a target and emerged a leader. Margaret's ambush had failed, Sophia's complicity exposed, and James's trust vindicated. For the first time in a year, Elena felt the full measure of her father's faith, and her own strength to carry it forward. 6 months had passed since the night Elena Harper walked back into the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, binders in hand, and turned Margaret Pierce's ambush into a reckoning. The air in Houston felt lighter now, the humid weight of early September, softening into a crisp fall breeze as Elena stood outside the gleaming new Harper manufacturing facility in Austin. The second plant, born from contracts secured in the wake of that fateful gala, hummed with activity, its steel walls reflecting the late afternoon sun. Inside, 32 new employees joined the ranks of a workforce that had once teetered on the edge of layoffs, a testament to the growth she'd fought for. The company wasn't just surviving under her leadership, it was thriving, and the business community that had once booed her now pointed to Harper Manufacturing as a model of resilience and heart. That night 6 months ago had been a crucible, forging Elena into someone she hadn't known she could be. Walking back into the ballroom, armed with her father's truth, had shifted something fundamental, not just in how Houston saw her, but in how she saw herself. The echoes of Margaret's accusations and Sophia's smirks had faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own resolve. She'd spent the weeks that followed networking with a fervor James would have admired, turning apologies from gala guests into partnerships. Gregory Thompson doubled his company's order, citing her guts and grace. 3 wavering clients returned with long-term contracts, drawn by the story of a CEO who'd faced public shame and emerged stronger. The numbers told the tale: revenue up, jobs added, a second facility ribbon cut just last month. But the real victory, Elena knew, wasn't in the spreadsheets. It was in the trust she'd reclaimed from others and herself. The aftermath for Margaret and Sophia unfolded in unexpected ways. 2 weeks after the gala, Sophia appeared at Elena's office unannounced, her crimson dress swapped for jeans and a nervous twist of her hands. "I need a job," she'd said bluntly, avoiding Elena's gaze. "Mom's burned through most of her savings on those lawsuits, and my trust from Dad doesn't kick in for 3 years." Elena studied her stepsister, searching for the smugness she'd seen at the gala, but finding only a raw, reluctant honesty. Against Charles's advice, "She's a liability, Elena," she offered Sophia an entry-level role in marketing. To her surprise, Sophia accepted, and more surprising still, she'd shown real talent. Crafting campaigns with a flair Elena hadn't anticipated. They weren't friends, not by a long shot. Too much history lay between them. But a tentative respect had taken root, a fragile bridge over years of distance. Margaret, meanwhile, had vanished from Houston's social scene. Word trickled back that she'd moved to Phoenix, chasing a wealthy widower with a penchant for golf and a fat bank account. Elena hadn't heard from her since that final, furious exit from the gala. "This isn't over," and doubted their paths would cross again. The trust James left ensured Margaret's financial security, but her pride, it seemed, had driven her to greener pastures. Elena felt no bitterness, only a quiet relief that the storm had passed. Her own life had transformed in ways she hadn't expected. For years, music had defined her. The piano, her companion, through a lonely childhood after her mother's death, through the awkward years of blending families when James married Margaret, through the grueling conservatory days and endless tours. When James got sick, stepping away from performing felt like a temporary pause, a sacrifice for the father she'd already let down too often. But running Harper Manufacturing awakened something new, a love for the challenge, the satisfaction of solving problems, the quiet pride of creating jobs. She still played, late at night when the house was still, her fingers finding solace in Chopin or Beethoven. Yet the music had shifted, less a career, more a personal refuge, a thread to the girl she'd been. Last month, she'd done something James would have loved. The Thomas Carter Foundation, renamed the James Harper Foundation in her mind's quiet moments, launched with a mission to bring music education to Texas's underprivileged schools and business mentorship to young entrepreneurs. It wove together the 2 halves of her life, a legacy that honored her father's dual passions. At the launch event, held in the original Houston factory, Elena performed publicly for the first time since taking over the company. A grand piano sat amid the machines, gleaming black against the industrial gray, and she played James's favorite Chopin nocturne, its haunting notes drifting over the hum of equipment. Employees gathered, their faces soft with recognition. Some had worked for James since the beginning, their livelihoods now secured by her hands. As the final chord faded, Elena felt her father's presence, not a ghost, but a warmth. A quiet pride that wrapped around her heart. She rose from the bench, tears glistening but unshed, and looked out at the crowd. "Inheritance isn't just about what you're given," she'd said, her voice steady. "It's about carrying forward the best of those we've lost, and adding something of our own." The applause that followed wasn't the hesitant clap of the gala night. It was full, genuine, a sound that echoed through the factory and into her bones. She'd realized then that James had been right all along. Some legacies aren't stolen. They're earned, forged through grit and love. Now, standing outside the Austin plant, Elena watched workers file out at shift's end, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Sophia was inside, tweaking a new ad campaign. Their exchanges were still clipped, but there was a rhythm to their work, a mutual understanding growing like ivy over old wounds. The business community hailed Harper Manufacturing as innovative, ethical, a beacon of what determination could build. Elena had found a harmony she hadn't sought, the artist she'd been blending seamlessly with the leader she'd become. She pulled her phone from her pocket, scrolling to a photo of James, taken years ago, his grin wide as he stood beside the first factory's cornerstone. "You were right, Dad," she whispered, the wind carrying her words away. "Some things are worth fighting for." She slipped the phone back, her gaze lifting to the horizon. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. A new day's promise, built on a legacy she'd made her own. Elena Harper's story isn't just about a company saved or a family feud won. It's about what we do when life tests us. 6 months after that gala night, she didn't just rebuild her father's legacy. She made it her own, proving that the hardest battles can forge the strongest hearts. We all have a legacy to carry, whether it's a promise, a dream, or a fight for what's right. So, take this with you. No matter how loud the boos get, your truth is worth standing for. If Elena's journey moved you, hit that subscribe button below. Let's keep sharing stories that lift us up together.